Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to wrap up chapter 5. There's really not much left that we're going to talk about, but I wanted to go over, again, sort of discussing the rationalization of society. We had talked about some of the main concepts of the groups that do exist within this. We talked and sort of ended on the 6 degrees of separation in reference to Kevin Bacon. I want to talk about bureaucracies. Bureaucracies are defined as those formal organizations. They basically characterized in 5 features, which we're going to talk about. Those 5 features really help them reach their goals, grow, and endure. So let's talk about those. First off, clear levels with assignments are very important. In any kind of formal organization, right, we expect that there's almost like a separate levels that exist within things. Those assignments flow downward from the top, right? Management sort of brings it down to those at the front lines. They're going to be participating in that sense, right? And of course, accountability flows upward. So think about it. If you're working at an organization like Pizza Hut or McDonald's, right? All of a sudden, if you're on the fryers and something happens, right, you have to report to management. So that accountability has to go upwards. Not necessarily that your managers need to tell you what they've done wrong, necessarily. It's typically that upward flow. The second one is the division of labor. What does that mean? Think about it. Let me back up 1 second and say that these formal organizations are secondary groups, right? They're designed to help us achieve very explicit objectives, right? We have them in almost every kind of formal organization, whether it's with the different groups that we have nowadays, different places, different organizations. You probably can hear about them all the time. Think back to early examples like the guilds and the armies, right? When we had industrialization, those secondary groups became very common. And they, of course, increased in size, and then they developed more into bureaucracies, in a sense. The more you jump into sociology, you're going to see that Max Weber utilized these characteristics that we're going to be talking about right now to sort of help organizations reach their goals, sort of help them grow and endure, in a sense. So let's jump back into that division of labor. Think about it. We have the concept of manufacturing, right? And in those groups, how often do individuals working at a manufacturing place typically see that end result, right? So if you're making a boot, you're not necessarily seeing all those components of the boot. You're merely seeing a part of it, just within it, right? Where each worker has some specific task, and with the end intention that there's going to be some type of purpose to it, right? Think about in college, if a teacher doesn't necessarily fix that heating system, right? The president necessarily doesn't approve those class schedules. A secretary doesn't necessarily evaluate to what textbooks we're using. So these tasks are distributed among people who've been trained to do them, quintessentially. The third one is written rules. So in an attempt to become efficient, bureaucracies a lot of times stress written procedures. You hear that all the time, right? Those written procedures have been in existence for quite some time, where the longer a bureaucracy exists and the longer it grows, the more written rules it has. So the rules of some bureaucracies cover just about every kind of situation possible. Now, like through your school, through Berlin, all of a sudden now those rules are published in handbooks. You get student manuals, that kind of thing. And of course, sometimes you have separate ones. Faculty might have one manual. Students might have one manual. Administrators might have one manual. Civil service workers, and on and on and on, right? Those written rules become extremely important because it's what guides individuals and sort of brings them back all in all. The fourth one is written communications and records. We know records are kept for much of what occurs in some type of bureaucracy, right? If you ever had to write an email and you have to CC somebody on it, right? So you have to make sure you incorporate everybody that it might be applicable to. Some workers detail their activities in written reports. Let me give you an example. So at ACM, right? Each semester that I do, faculty have to produce a summary of hours that we were spent doing certain kind of activities. I have to be able to report grades, participation, all that stuff. And we submit certain kinds of reports along the way to sort of help guide and to evaluate the course overall. So those materials a lot of times will then go to other committees, right, to evaluate the performance of each faculty member. So each time you guys take a test, each time you my syllabus is reviewed, all that stuff. So those written communications and records are extremely important throughout this process. The fifth and final one is impersonality and replaceability. We know that an office is important, but the individual necessarily isn't always the case. Right? So each worker is a replaceable unit in a bureaucracy. Think about it. You work for an organization. If you work at McDonald's or Pizza Hut or wherever, right? You know that if you were to quit or if you were to get fired or whatever the case is, right? They're not necessarily going to say, okay, we can never replace that individual ever again. It's just not, we can't fill that position. That's just it. In reality, we know that that person can be very replaceable. So look at it from my perspective. If I were to retire, someone else is going to be appointed